welcome to a new podcast episode of Radiology AI. My name is Dania Daye, and I'm the Associate Editor for Social Media for Radiology AI. And today, my co-host Paul and I are very excited to bring a new episode of the podcast series. In today's episode, we're going to be interviewing Dr. Thomas O'Neill and Dr. Ronald Peshok on the recent paper that they published in the journal. Their paper is entitled Active Reprioritization of the Reading Work List Using Artificial Intelligence Has a Beneficial Effect on the Turnaround Time for Interpretation of Head CT with Intracranial Hemorrhage. Dr. O'Neill and Dr. Peshok, thank you for joining us today. We're very excited about this episode. First, I will start with a few introductions. Dr. O'Neill is formerly the Informatics Medical Director at Parkland Health and Hospital System and Assistant Professor at UT Southwestern Medical Center in the Neuroradiology section. He is currently the Director of Informatics as Associate Professor of Neuroradiology in the Department of Radiology at Texas Tech University of El Paso. He received his bachelor's degree in biochemistry from the University of Texas at Austin, followed by earning his medical degree at the University of Texas Medical School at Houston. He then completed his radiology residency at Texas Tech University of El Paso and received advanced training through a fellowship in neuroradiology at UT Southwestern. Dr. O'Neill focuses his research on functional magnetic resonance imaging and imaging informatics, including being the first author of the paper we're discussing today. Dr. Peshok is Professor of Radiology at UT Southwestern Medical Center with a secondary appointment as Professor of Internal Medicine. He served as the Radiology Department's Vice Chair of Information Technology. His clinical interests include atherosclerosis, cardiovascular disease, cardiovascular imaging, and coronary CT angiography. Dr. Peshok holds a bachelor's degree in mathematics from Michigan State University. He earned his medical degree at UT Southwestern, where he also completed his residency in internal medicine and fellowships in cardiovascular diseases and cardiology research. In addition to imaging informatics, Dr. Peshok's research focuses on the development and use of MRI in the evaluation of cardiovascular disease and physiology, and he is a pioneer in the development of MRI techniques for this purpose. Dr. Peshok is the senior author of the paper that we're discussing in today's episode. Dr. O'Neill and Dr. Peshok, thank you for joining us today. I will turn it over to my co-host, Paul, to discuss the paper.
Dania, thank you for the introduction, and thank you to Drs. O'Neill and Peshok for joining us on the Radiology AI podcast. Both of you are imaging informaticists in addition to being clinical radiologists, but at pretty different stages in your careers. Can you share your stories about how you got involved with imaging informatics and in AI in radiology? Maybe we can start with Dr. O'Neill.
Basically, I kind of born this way, I guess. My dad and my grandfather were both radiologists and kind of early adopters of technology. And I remember growing up and my dad would have a, kind of early primitive teleradiology setup, and we'd be out at the hunting lease or out in the Gulf of Mexico, and he'd be reading x-rays. I kind of I have it in my blood. And, fast forward to me joining staff at UT Southwestern, and I had some great mentors, Dr. Peshok and Dr. Browning, to name a few, and they were sort of just looking to fill the role for the Parkland Informatics position, and it seemed like a good fit for me, given my background in technology, and it just sort of was being in the right place at the right time. Just as AI was kind of starting to become something that could be clinically applicable, and so I think it's sort of just really just timing for me.
Well, it's interesting. My father was not a radiologist, okay, but he was an electrical engineer, and so there was always electronics of one kind or another around our house when I was growing up, and then when I went to college, actually worked on some very, very primitive projects in terms of trying to learn how to play games and so forth. And so in medical school and residency, I was always interested in imaging and informatics, and this led me to get involved in a lot of different kinds of projects, like software for scheduling students, driving, software that drives MRI machines, reporting echocardiograms, and some automated tools for MRI and CT. And so I guess they noticed that I was interested in these things, so they asked me to be the assistant dean for informatics at UT Southwestern, and that really allowed me to, work in informatics and work closely with IT professionals and administration, to help implement EMRs and PACS and so forth. And then when Neil Rofsky became the chair of radiology at Southwestern, he asked me to become the vice chair for informatics and form an informatics division. And so again, Dr. O'Neill joined this group and did wonderful work. And we, sorry to see him leave, but we have also 4 other radiologists who are board certified in clinical informatics. And so they really form the core of our effort in terms of learning how to use AI in radiology.
That's fantastic to hear. And Dr. O'Neill, this is pretty new news to me. Can you tell us a little bit about your current role? Sounds like
right. Well, right. Yeah. So, I mean, I really, I had a wonderful, experience at UT and was able to kind of be the radiology informaticist for Parkland. And through that, I was able to get my board certification in clinical informatics. And shortly, kind of, I guess, after doing all that, I was kind of recruited back to the place that I did my residency to head up the department for, be the director of informatics for this department here at Texas Tech in El Paso. So it's exciting, because I can really take what I've learned and apply it here. There's a lot that can be done, and I'm really looking forward to this new adventure and, all the things that I can do for the department and the clinical care here out in the borderland. So.
Yeah, definitely. That sounds really exciting. And one thing I love about informatics is that we can all come from really different backgrounds. Maybe we're not all engineers. Maybe we all didn't have parents who are radiologists, but there's something that usually brings us together. And I think the thread that I've often seen is curiosity and really interest in technology and seeing how it can not only make things more fun, but I think make things better for our patients. So in light of that, you both recently published a really interesting paper in the Radiology AI journal titled Active Reprioritization of the Reading Worklist Using AI Has a Beneficial Effect on the Turnaround Time for Interpretation of Head CT with Intracranial Hemorrhage. So that's a mouthful, but basically you evaluated a commercially available AI model for detection of intracranial hemorrhage on turnaround times for radiology reports. And I think this is really interesting because this wasn't just a proof of concept or a retrospective study, but this was an actual clinical deployment, if I'm not mistaken. So can you tell us about the motivation and the background for the study and how it came to be?
Well, let me just start, and Thomas will finish. Well, it was very clear, that we and that AI tools really hold great promise for radiology. But having great algorithms, that's essential. But translating them into the radiologist's workflow is also critical. And I think we all know of advances that were not successful because the tool or software didn't really fit into the radiologist's workflow. And I can tell you, I saw this kind of firsthand in implementing the EMR. It was very easy to implement software in a way that actually made work worse and more difficult, for the clinician. And I think what we saw is that success was really dependent upon physicians who could work closely with the frontline physicians and IT personnel to ensure they understood what would work. So we really wanted to do a project that and needed a radiologist champion who was knowledgeable in informatics, and that was Thomas. Okay.
Right. Yeah. And I mean, as you said, I mean, there are a lot of algorithms out there. I mean, a lot of intracranial hemorrhage packages out there, and they may or may not have similar performance, just at the image level. But it was really, we wanted to figure out how we could really implement it in clinical care, and I mean, that was sort of the driving factor behind the whole project. So, what's the best way to do that?
Yeah, and I might just add that the practice at UT Southwestern is a lot like many centers around the country, where it's demanding, involving a really busy, high complexity academic practice and an extremely busy safety net hospital with high acuity and patient volumes. And I think, Thomas, you would say the number of cases to be read can be overwhelming.
Yeah, it depends. But for sure, yes. I mean, for sure, having tools to help us do that, is always welcome. So.
Yeah, and I think from a hospital standpoint, one of the things they worry about, and obviously neuroradiology worries about, is that there are cases that are ordered as routine and are at the bottom of the work list, but in fact do contain a critical finding. And we were interested also as how would this impact turnaround time in these cases?
Yeah, I think that's definitely something that's been a hot topic for AI, reprioritizing the list, triaging things, and making sure that we can appropriately get to the more urgent studies quicker. And so I know that a lot of our listeners have heard about the software that you evaluated specifically by AI Doc. And I'm sure a lot of us, including myself, are curious about how it works. I've never actually used it. I've seen some mock-ups at conferences like SIM. So can you walk us through what you did in the study and what your main findings were?
Sure, I can take that. So I mean, just to answer your kind of first question about what is it and how does it work? I mean, basically it's receiving images from directly. Well, we have it, forwarding images based on study description from PACS as soon as they're received to their, basically to their edge server, and from there it's processed, and those results are then sent back. And now what you do with those results is what we were kind of interested in and looking at. And so, I mean, just broadly speaking, our goal was to, study the effect of implementing an intracranial hemorrhage detection tool on just routine clinical workflow on our report turnaround time. And since we sort of implemented it in 3 different phases, and that allowed us to study, if the impact on turnaround time was dependent on the manner that the information was presented into the radiologist. So the 3 phases we implemented it in were we did it as they kind of became available. So it was kind of naturally lent itself to studying the effects of these different phases. But so the first phase was just kind of a notification widget, which is a little orange icon on the corner of the screen that pops up, and you can hover over it, and it'll show you kind of a preview and list of studies that had findings. That was the first phase. The second phase was actually integrating it into the clinical work list that we use every day, and that we basically had it add a flag to those cases, so that didn't change their order or anything and how they were presented to the radiologist. It was just adding a little flag in the corner that was a little yellow flag that said AI. The third phase was actually integrating into the work list and then reprioritizing it. So we have an existing prioritization model with those work lists based on order priority and patient location. No, this was a third piece of information that we integrated into the prioritization model. And so we were able to get timestamps of end exam, initial report creation time, for the first report submission time, and we also knew the order priority, the patient location, and so we were able to basically calculate the wait time since the order was ended to that reports was generated. And we knew the queue of exams that were waiting based on what had been ended in that time period that was higher priority. And so we were able to also see how long it took to basically generate that report. And just the main findings, basically the widget, the phase 1 and phase 2, so the widget and the flagging alone really didn't have much of an effect compared to baseline when we didn't have any. And once we had the data for phase 3, I mean, we noticed that basically flagging with reprioritization demonstrated a bigger reduction in the wait time as the queue size was increased.
Yeah, and I think that's really a key point that what Thomas and our and the team was able to show was that this effect increased. The importance of the effect actually increased as the queue size increases. Okay, it's kind of what you would expect, and I think that it's a very interesting issue when you're trying to look at measures like turnaround time. Okay, there's so many factors which can influence it. And then Thomas may want to comment on this, that we spent a lot of time looking at how to basically control for those other factors. And because that's really going to help you when you start looking at the impact of these algorithms. Again, how can you show definitively that in fact, it's the algorithm that's making the difference?
Right.
So,
and yeah, I mean, I guess I also would add that we also kind of designed this in a way that, in some regard, I tried to isolate the performance of the algorithm from the actual just implementation and the presentation. And so we were really just focused on the implementation piece and how does the flag itself and reprioritization affect our workflow.
Yeah, I actually thought that was one of the most interesting findings was that you had these three phases. And as you explained, it was very maybe serendipitous that it was just different features that AI Doc had put out. So I have a couple questions because I thought often about how do we actually interface with these algorithms? Is it going to be an additional button we have to click through or a series of buttons, or can it be something that's really seamless and can not just not slow us down, but actually help us be more efficient? And so I'm curious, one, are these different implementations of the widget, of the flag, and of the reprioritization, are those options that you can choose as a customer of the AI doc solution? And number two, in those first two phases, we know that there wasn't really any impact on turnaround time, but did you have any maybe subjective experience that maybe it slowed you down? Maybe it was something that caused a little bit of an extra mental burden? Because I've thought often back to my mammography rotations where we have CAD, and I don't think it's that controversial to say that it can sometimes be more trouble than it's worth. At least my opinion. So I'm curious what your experience was, maybe either from yourself, your colleagues, or even trainees, because I'm sure that'd be pretty interesting also to know how is that affecting the education.
Sure. I can start with, answering that that component of, the clinical effect of actually having that notification. It's nice when it works. It's really nice when it works. If you don't have a flag, there's also that consideration. If you can trust an algorithm, you're going to also read those cases that are negative by the algorithm potentially faster. So I guess there's two sides of that coin. We definitely did have, and we can talk about this a little bit later, but there were in some of the pitfalls. We definitely did have cases that an unexpected thing that came up was, for example, we have a lot of post-surgical cases that we kind of expect to have intracranial hemorrhage, and so yes, it was flagging those. Was that necessary or was that helpful? It depends. So I think some of the interesting things that we ran into in doing this, but we sort of used our experience along the way, with the widget and then the implementation of into the work list. We kind of used our experience to help drive how we did that and how we implemented it. And so having the vendor AI doc was great at accepting our feedback, and we met with them regularly and I think helped influence their development, and that's how we arrived at our phase 3 in that iteration.
Yeah, the one comment I can add is that basically the experience with the widget versus the flag versus the reprioritization has really driven our implementation of other algorithms. Let's say for pulmonary embolism or for incidental pulmonary embolism, and because again, the reprioritization of the work list seems to be a pretty acceptable approach, don't you think, Thomas, for the radiologist?
Yes, people weren't having to go to another tool, and you're in your existing workflow. You weren't really learning any new workflow. There's definitely education involved, but it's not anything drastically different. So I think that was definitely acceptable, an easy thing to implement from a clinical standpoint.
Yeah, that's super interesting. Shifting gears slightly, but a related topic is the adoption of AI. I think UT Southwestern is clearly unique in being a pretty early adopter of AI. And your department probably has more experience than most radiologists out there in actually using these tools, vetting them, and even being part of the process to refine them with the vendors, which I think is a really interesting kind of relationship. And so I'm curious, when deciding to adopt these algorithms in your practice, one, what was the basis behind the decision to implement them? And two, were there any unforeseen obstacles or pitfalls that you encountered along the way, maybe logistical? One thing that comes to mind for me is oftentimes for our neuro studies, we'll basically do one scan, whether it's through the head, the neck, and maybe even the C-spine. And so I can imagine a world where maybe an algorithm is perfect, has perfect performance on a head CT, but as soon as it encounters a neck, it might start getting pretty confused. And so we've seen examples of that in our literature where algorithms see images they've never seen before, and then they start calling some really weird diagnoses. I'm curious about what's your experience has been, and if you have any advice for other departments considering implementing these algorithms.
So in terms of deciding on the AI algorithms to adopt, it was clear that AI tools were really just going to be and played a very increasing role, in our clinical practice in radiology, and with a busy, demanding practice, high complexity cases and things like that, large volumes. It was sort of obvious that we wanted to be at the forefront of this, I think, and it was a good target to start with intracranial hemorrhage, just because it's common exam, a common finding, and relatively, and the algorithms were out there. So, I think it was pretty natural to start with that. And as far as, unforeseen obstacles, I think, there were issues with some of the imaging protocols, as you mentioned. Slice thickness, for what the algorithm was expecting, for what we were sending, that was from certain scanners and things like that we had to fix initially when we first implemented it. So that was kind of logistical kind of issues to think about. And there were other things with the work list once we started integrating it with the work list, how we were gonna actually execute that and make it work. What color does the flag need to be? That sort of thing. Sounds silly, but those little UI things make a difference. And
I totally agree. It's amazing, okay, how little things can make a difference here, okay. And as Thomas has said, one of the things that seems to me to be becoming important here is to have really standardized imaging protocols, okay. That if you're going to expect the performance to be high across multiple machines, multiple sites, and so forth, that really needs to be tightly controlled. And luckily, that's one of the things that we have here is across all the machines and hospitals that we have, uniform acquisition protocols. Okay, so I think that's an important aspect. And then, the second thing is Thomas alluded to is that when you're doing this integration, now you have to contend not only with the AI vendor, but also the PACS vendor, okay, whoever is delivering your work list. And it may be that they're in a software cycle where it's only the next version that will support this, okay? And I'm sure, we've all experienced that where one thing is dependent upon another. So, just be aware that might turn out to an unforeseen obstacle, as you say. And again, as Thomas alluded, there's the impact of certain referral patterns. If you have a very active neurosurgical service, okay, then you're going to deal with post-surgical patients. If you have a different kind of practice, it might very well, in a sense, your pretest probability going into the algorithm might be very different.
I think that's really interesting because to me, it signals something beyond just the algorithms. It really signals having a strong base in imaging informatics kind of at a fundamental level about how do we implement these working in concert with our PACS vendors? How do we implement these in a way that's going to be conducive to the current workflow that may differ at different hospitals? And also dealing with the image acquisition, making sure it's standardized. On that note, I'm curious about that idea of standardizing the image acquisition. There's been a lot of talk about generalizability of AI algorithms and how even changing the same scanner within the same institution can really cause an algorithm performance to drop pretty considerably. And so I'm wondering, was there any type of local fine-tuning or transfer learning process associated with this, where maybe AI doc could come take some of your cases from the hospital and try to fine-tune things to fit that particular scanner?
The answer is no, correct, Thomas?
No, yeah. We took it off the shelf.
Yeah. Now, one thing that I will say is you bring up an excellent point about scanners getting software upgrades or whatever, and that changes the characteristics of the images. And that's one of the things that the vendor can help you with. They can actually monitor for that, so they can look at if there's a sudden change in the detection rate, okay, on a particular scanner. And I know that AI Doc has actually done that they've gone to hospitals and determined that all of a sudden a scanner starts performing differently. So I think again, it kind of comes back to just like everything in radiology, you do have to maintain quality control, okay? You have to know that the scanner is functioning properly, that it hasn't degraded in some important way. And so again, I think increasingly, there's an element of implementing these which will require ongoing quality control.
Yeah, definitely. I like what you're saying about how in this process you've really shown that traditional types of roles in a radiology department, whether it's someone dealing with quality control, maybe the medical physicist who's in charge of calibrating machines, making sure that when software updates happen, that there aren't unforeseen artifacts, with IT staff within the institution to implement these things in the PACS. Because to me, it signals this general idea that AI is not going to replace radiologists, but it's going to be a tool that we use to make us better. And ultimately, I think that it also drives home the point for me that all of the people that we currently work with, not just in radiology, but with medical physics, with imaging IT, et cetera, and even with the vendors, it's still going to be the same kind of fundamental profession that we do. And for me, one of the biggest things about imaging informatics is this multidisciplinary kinds of collaboration.
Couldn't agree with you more. This is another tool for the radiologist, another part of their armamentarium that makes them, provide better care for patients and hopefully makes their life somewhat easier.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So as we move into the last couple of minutes of our time together, I want to ask you a question that we ask all of our guests. What are you most excited about for the next decade in radiology AI or imaging informatics or anything else? Go
ahead, Dr. O'Neill.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I'm excited for AI to really become, mainstream and just become seamless to our, as you were saying. I mean, there are tools that can affect all parts of the clinical workflow from acquisition, quality control. I mean, even scheduling or protocoling, and more than just detection and things like that. I mean, and even the integrations are very powerful. So if we can get those integrations right, we can use the tool to detect a change in the scanner and then trigger, alerts to medical physics to go look at that scanner. I mean, the possibilities are endless. I mean, you could connect it to your scheduling system or to other parts of your workflow. And so I think that's what I'm most excited about, is integrating these tools in seamless manners to just really drive all parts of our workflow.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with Dr. O'Neill more. We've just scratched the surface on this. Okay, there's so much more you could do. And the other thing that excites me too is, because I kind of come from a enterprise background, is I believe that we vastly underutilize the information in images, that we could deliver so much more to help care for the patient and obviously help the radiologist, but also help the referring physicians. There's just so much more information that we can deliver. And the key is going to be, how to, use this and deliver it in such a way that it's not overwhelming. You alluded to this a little bit, and I think there are ways to do that. But to do that, you're really going to require people that are expert in informatics, and particularly radiologists that are experts in informatics that can interact with the hospital teams, can interact with the EMR team, all of those things. And so I think the future is really bright here. Okay, and I'm really excited about the fact that people like yourselves early in their career, that they're embracing this, because this is going to change the world.
I couldn't agree more. I think it's an exciting future, whether it's in the immediacy with clinical integration, using some of the lessons that you've learned in your experience with the AI doc software, or beyond, and trying to utilize all of the imaging data available. So again, Drs. O'Neill, Dr. Peshok, thank you again so much for your time, your experience, your wisdom, and your insights.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you for having us.
And with that, I'll give it back to Dania.
Thank you, Dr. O'Neill and Dr. Peshok, for a great discussion. And thank you for sharing with us more information about your paper, evaluating an AI model for detecting intracranial hemorrhage and the turnaround times for radiology reports. I'm sure many of our listeners will benefit from hearing how this project came together and hearing about the results that came in this paper. To our listeners, thank you for tuning in to this podcast episode. As usual, don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe to our Radiology AI podcast series on any of iTunes, Google Podcasts, or Spotify. Please stay tuned for our next episode.